A devastating crash in a bustling industrial area, a lot of conflicting information and comparisons with other accidents, plus the grounding of an entire legendary aircraft type. The tragedy of UPS Flight 2976 shocked the world and devastated UPS itself, since it took place right at the airline's main hub in Kentucky. And as is always the case when a tragedy grabs people's attention, it created a lot of difficult questions. So far, Petra and I have been really careful in our approach to this accident because we did not want to speculate on what the answers to those difficult questions might be. Instead, we went live together with an actual investigator to talk about how the experts in the NTSB will find that truth. And if you missed it, you can watch that over on our Captain Speaking podcast channel. Since then, the Mentour team has been monitoring all the news around the crash, and now that the NTSB's preliminary report is out, it's time to look at the verified facts in that report and, just as importantly, some details that this report is not yet talking about. On the evening of November the 4th, 2025, UPS Flight 2976 departed from Louisville in Kentucky in the United States. The flight was scheduled to carry freight from Louisville to Honolulu as part of the company's overnight long-haul network connecting North America with Asia and the Pacific. Louisville Mohammed Ali International Airport is home to UPS's central cargo hub, and the company calls it their world port. The aircraft involved was registered November 259 Uniform Papa, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 freighter built in 1991 that first served with Thai Airways as a passenger jet until it was converted for cargo service in 2006 and purchased by UPS. The MD-11 freighter is one of the most recognisable jets out there thanks to its almost unique tri-jet configuration. It was developed in the late 1980s as a final evolution of the DC-10, sharing that three-engine layout but incorporating an extended fuselage, new winglets, updated digital flight controls, plus a redesigned flight deck with glass instruments that also eliminated the navigator position that the DC-10 had, bringing the flight crew down from 3 to 2. With these changes, McDonnell Douglas promised that the MD-11 would have the range and the payload of a jumbo jet, but with a lower fuel burn than a 747. Well, that's the theory. In practice, the MD-11 fell short of its performance targets. Passenger airlines discovered that the plane couldn't quite match its advertised range or efficiency. So by the early 2000s, most passenger operators had moved on to twins like the Boeing 777 or Airbus A330, and the tri-jet gradually faded from passenger service. However, the MD-11 found a second life as a freighter. Its high thrust, large cargo volume and long range made it ideal for companies such as UPS and FedEx, especially when they were able to buy them at steep discounts from passenger airlines. At the time of the UPS crash, roughly 60 MD-11s remained in active commercial service, all of them hauling freight for UPS, FedEx and Western Global. For these cargo carriers, the MD-11 offers a good balance between payload and reach. Fully loaded, it can carry more than 200,000 pounds of cargo across oceans, which makes it great for long-range routes where smaller freighters like the 767-300F would really struggle. And its large internal volume makes it a decent package freighter too. And while the MD-11 is significantly less efficient than more modern twin jets, cargo operators don't fly their planes for as many hours a day as passenger airlines do, so the higher fuel costs are offset by the lower purchase price. But that tri-jet layout adds maintenance costs and creates some operational complexity. For example, the MD-11 center engine isn't as easy for ground crews to reach as the wing-mounted engines, plus it's mounted through the tail, requiring a complex network of ducts and controls. Separately, the plane's long, efficient wing design and its relatively small tail surfaces make it sensitive to pitch and energy changes near the ground, although from what I've heard having spoken to pilots who fly it, they actually really like it. Still, over the years, several MD-11 accidents have involved hard landings or loss of control during landing. And as late as 2009, FedEx Flight 80, which Petra recently covered over on the Mentour pilot channel, was lost in a crash at Narita Airport when their first officer got behind the aircraft in heavy crosswinds. Despite those quirks, the type remained a mainstay for UPS's long-haul fleet. It sits between the company's 767Fs used for domestic and regional routes and its 747-8Fs, which handle the heaviest intercontinental sectors. Still, in terms of age, the MD-11 is the oldest type that UPS is operating today. But even so, the MD-11 is capable of carrying large payloads to Hawaii, Asia and Europe while burning less fuel than the four-engined Boeing 747s. But despite its relative success in its second life as a heavy freighter, the MD-11 is quickly being retired. So the last of them was actually due to be sent away to the desert and the scrap heap by 2032. But the tragic event that we're going to look at today could end up accelerating that timeline rapidly. And I'm going to get to that after this. Now, with the holiday season approaching, the next month or so is going to involve a lot of online shopping. Holiday gifts, end of year deals, maybe even some travel bookings. And unfortunately, cyber criminals have been preparing for this all year. There's always a spike in fake shopping sites during the holidays, and they're designed to look completely legitimate. However, their sole purpose is to steal your credit card information and personal details. And that's one of the reasons why I use today's sponsor, NordVPN. Their Threat Protection Pro feature does something really smart. It checks every single website before it loads on your screen. And if it looks fishy, it just won't let you through. In June 2025 alone, they blocked over 50 million phishing attempts, but it does even more than that. You know, when you search for leather shoes and suddenly all you see are ads for leather shoes? Your phone isn't necessarily listening to you, it's marketers leaving tracking devices on your search history so that they can serve you targeted ads. Threat Protection Pro blocks these trackers and these ads, making it harder for these companies to build a profile of you. And I really recommend that you give it a try. Just scan this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/mentor now and you'll get 4 extra months free with their 2-year plan, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee so you can try it risk-free. Thanks NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. Now, UPS 2976 began its takeoff roll on runway 17 right in Louisville at 22:12 UTC or 5:12 PM local time. There were 3 crew members on the flight deck of this MD-11, the captain, the first officer, and the relief captain on the jump seat. The NTSB's preliminary report revealed that the first officer was the pilot flying and the captain was pilot monitoring, and that this was a very experienced crew. The captain had 8,613 total flight hours, of which 4,918 were on the MD-11. The first officer actually had slightly more total flight hours than the captain, around 9,200, but he had fewer hours on type, just 994. There was also a second captain acting as a relief pilot, who was the most experienced of the 3, with 15,250 hours total time, of which 8,775 hours were on type. These guys definitely weren't rookies. But during the takeoff roll, witnesses around the airport saw signs that something was going wrong. So several of them started to film the takeoff with their phones. Eyewitness video, including security and dashcam footage, showed what appeared to be quite a severe flame visible from its left wing near engine number 1 as it continued down the runway during the takeoff attempt. Seconds later, the aircraft, seemingly unable to climb, passed beyond the airport boundary, still attempting to gain height. Data from flight tracking sources show that the aircraft managed to reach a ground speed of roughly 186 knots, but it never achieved a stable climb. It did lift off, but the NTSB would later confirm that the maximum altitude that the aircraft reached was around 100 feet over the ground, but that altitude estimate would change again later. In one of its daily briefings, the NTSB confirmed early on that sometime during the takeoff roll, the left or number 1 engine became separated from the aircraft. Now, the NTSB had access to airport CCTV footage showing this. However, that footage was not made public. Pictures of that engine on the ground that we've all seen show that it came to a rest near the far end of the runway, close to a windsock and the PAPI lights for the aircraft landing on the opposite side of the same runway, runway 35 left. The NTSB also confirmed that most of the pylon, which holds the engine to the wing, had also separated from the wing itself. Then, when the NTSB released its preliminary report on the 20th of November, we finally got to see 6 frames from that airport CCTV footage showing how the number 1 engine broke loose and flew off the left wing. The engine tilted up, then traversed over the fuselage before hitting the ground and breaking apart. Crucially, all of this happened as the aircraft rotated for takeoff, way beyond V1, which is the highest speed at which the first action to reject a takeoff can actually commence. Now, I should mention here that the MD-11, like most 2 or 3 engine jets, is designed to remain under control and be able to climb after losing thrust from one engine. But the physical separation of an engine and its pylon and associated systems can have consequences that go way beyond reduced thrust. And those problems can be difficult to diagnose because the departing engine and pylon can tear through hydraulic, electrical, fuel lines that are all routed through the wing, creating more failures. And it's really important to stress here that the preliminary report didn't include any information on what warnings the crew got or in what order, or importantly, why the aircraft didn't climb away as it should have done with an engine out. The MD-11 systems are automated to prioritize engine and fire messages, but the combination of fire, hydraulic loss, and a separated engine at near maximum takeoff weight would have left them only seconds to react. Thanks to the NTSB's earlier briefings, we now know that the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder have already been found and sent to the NTSB headquarters in Washington, DC, where specialists already extracted good data and high-quality cockpit audio, both of the crew's dialogue and any audible system warnings and callouts during the accident. Now, on that note, we learned that the crew got a repeating bell after V1. Specifically, one investigator described it as happening after the V-speeds, meaning that the pilots were already fully committed to flight when that bell sounded. And this actually corresponds well with the CCTV footage, which clearly shows the engine departing during rotation well after V1. But the NTSB specifically made a point here of calling that sound a bell, not a fire warning or even an alarm, which shows how investigators are trained not to make any assumptions in their work, even if they seem obvious. In any case, anything that happens after V1 means that we must commit to the takeoff, and we're trained to prioritize flying the aircraft and then to cancel any warnings until we get to a safe minimum altitude, typically 400 feet above the aerodrome, which unfortunately these pilots never reached. After takeoff, any damage to the wing's leading edge from the departing engine and pylon would have created some loss of lift and even some drag, although the separation of the dead engine would theoretically help reduce drag on that side. But even so, if the center engine and the right engine were still making full power, the asymmetric thrust would obviously cause a strong yawing tendency to the left and roll tendency in the same direction, which would be even stronger if there's a loss of lift from the damage to the left wing. Then there's also the danger of structural damage from the fuel fire that raged through the wing, although in this case the aircraft didn't stay in the air long enough for that to matter. However, what we do know is that despite everything that was thrown at them, and despite the fact that their plane was fully loaded with cargo and fuel for its trip to Hawaii, this crew appears to have managed to keep their stricken aircraft under control. The aircraft did not initially roll to the left. It tracked slightly left of the runway heading, which is something that I see fairly regularly when I'm training pilots in the sim, but here the MD-11's wings remained level until that became impossible. Unfortunately, the aircraft did not climb, which it should have been able to do after only losing one out of its 3 engines. Data from the plane's radio altimeter confirmed that it got no higher than around 30 feet above ground level, less than the estimated 100 feet that we first got from ADSB data. Unable to climb further, the MD-11's left main landing gear hit the roof of a UPS warehouse at the end of the airport perimeter, leaving a deep gash for nearly half the length of that roof before it gained a bit more altitude, at least briefly, before the aircraft then crossed a local road, but it was now losing altitude. The videos show the MD-11 hitting several electricity pylons, and then its level attitude came to an abrupt end when the left wing looks to have struck several oil tanks at a petroleum recycling facility. More fire followed that impact, and then the plane rolled into a 90-degree bank to the left before it impacted the ground. Flight 2976 was fully loaded for its flight to Hawaii that evening and carried nearly 220,000 pounds or around 100 metric tons of fuel, which for reference is more than the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 737 MAX 10. The crash destroyed several buildings and vehicles along and beyond the aircraft's path, igniting large fires that burned throughout the evening. Emergency workers from Louisville's airport and city fire departments worked for hours to contain the blaze and search for victims. And all 3 crew members were unfortunately killed in the accident. Officials have also confirmed 11 fatalities among people on the ground, with 2 more people seriously injured. 21 other people suffered minor injuries, with many people receiving treatment for burns and smoke inhalation. By early the next morning on November the 5th, Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport reopened on a limited basis while recovery crews secured the debris field and investigators walked the entire length of runway 17 right looking for any foreign debris. The accident site outside the airport is roughly half a mile long, with wreckage scattered across multiple properties. Runway 17 right was eventually reopened, but just days after the crash and well before the preliminary report, the FAA decided to release an Emergency Airworthiness Directive, or EAD, grounding all MD-11s that are still in service today. Now, that decision came after the airlines had already grounded these planes temporarily after Boeing recommended that they do. The EAD focused on the fitting of the engine to its nacelle and to the pylon and wing. And a few days after that, the FAA replaced that EAD with a new version which also grounded the older DC-10 since it uses a very similar engine and pylon setup. The two FAA EADs didn't actually specify a way for the operators of these aircraft to return them to service. This will likely come later when a new EAD supersedes this one. The NTSB's preliminary report clearly shows us why the FAA grounded these planes. Photos in the report show that the aft or rear mount of the engine pylon, which connects it to the wing, broke off, and there's evidence of fatigue cracking in the broken mount, suggesting that this was a problem that developed over time. Unsurprisingly, the NTSB have been adding metallurgists and other subject matter experts to their team as their investigation continues. Now, they'll be looking for signs of metal fatigue, overstress, or corrosion to see what's behind this failure. And this work is often painstakingly slow, but it's how investigators trace an accident like this back to its mechanical root. From here, the investigation will unfold in stages. The NTSB's teams also include experts in power plants, structures, systems, and human factors. Parallel to that, teams in Louisville and Washington DC are unpicking the aircraft's maintenance and inspection history. Investigators will review maintenance logs, component serial numbers, and previous inspection findings to understand if a pre-existing defect could have played a role here. The Human Factors Group are analysing crew training records, rest schedules, and the simulator currency, while the systems team, which will have support from Boeing and from UPS's own pilots and engineers, will look at how the MD-11's automated flight and warning systems responded once the failure began. UPS's internal safety department will supply them with more data and maintenance records for comparison across its MD-11 fleet. And depending on what they find, the NTSB could ask for more data from other MD-11 operators as well. Now, as soon as this accident happened, when it became clear that an engine had separated from the wing, people started parallels between this crash and the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 back in 1979. That aircraft, this time a DC-10, also suffered a fracture of the rear mount of the left engine's pylon, which caused the engine to separate, fly up and over the wing, very similar to what those still frames of the UPS accident sequence show. So it's easy to see here why people are making comparisons between that crash and the UPS one. Even the NTSB mentioned this older accident in its preliminary report as a similar event, but even though these accidents have much in common, they're also notable for how differently they evolved. American 191 eventually crashed because the departing engine and pylon ripped off part of the wing's leading edge, which caused a hydraulic leak, which in turn caused the slats on the left wing to retract, significantly altering the aerodynamic properties of that wing. Now, the design of those components was subsequently changed, both on the DC-10 and the MD-11, to make sure that the slats don't retract in an event like this again. But the point here is that the American Airlines DC-10 was still able to climb to about 325 feet above ground level before the slats retracted, causing it to roll and lose altitude. And that's completely different from what we saw happen to UPS Flight 2976. That aircraft barely cleared the blast fence at the end of the runway, reaching just 30 feet of altitude, basically staying in ground effect for the whole flight. That's less than 1/10 of the altitude that American 191 reached. Now, there are a lot of theories about why the UPS flight couldn't climb, many of them centering on the performance of engine number 2 in the tail of this MD-11 and ways that the departing engine could have affected it. Crucially though, the NTSB's preliminary report makes absolutely no mention of that engine, which is quite interesting. This report doesn't contain any analysis of the performance of the plane's 3 engines during the accident sequence. Any further engine trouble beyond the departing engine number 1 would have left this crew with just 1 out of 3 engines on a really heavy aircraft right on rotation, literally at the worst possible time. But that's where we must once again draw a line and wait for further information from the investigators in a future update. A final report with conclusions and safety recommendations typically takes between 12 and 24 months depending on the complexity of the investigation. The central questions investigators will aim to answer are straightforward in theory, but challenging in practice. What caused the engine and pylon to separate? Did that separation compromise hydraulic or structural systems that made the aircraft uncontrollable? And what does that mean for the remaining MD-11s out there? This is a really hard story to see and tell. A routine evening at the world's busiest cargo hub ended in a fire and a field of debris, with lives lost both in the aircraft and on the ground. The preliminary report sheds some light into what happened, but anything beyond that is still speculative. It's a devastating tragedy for UPS and for the city of Louisville. And as I said at the start, the sorting facility that UPS calls its world port is the centre of the company's global air network and the largest automated package handling facility on Earth. Flight 2976 was just one of hundreds of such flights that connect this facility with every corner of the world, and it's hard to imagine how this community of air and ground crews, package sorting staff and other workers at and around the airport, and of course all of their families and others involved in Louisville that depend on them, will be feeling right now and for the weeks and months to come. Until that final report tells us the full story, the most responsible thing we can do is honour those affected, support the investigators doing their slow, careful work, and let the evidence speak before we draw conclusions. And it's also worth paying close attention to the way the NTSB is handling this investigation and its communications with the world's press. Speculation is inevitable in all accidents, and when official information is limited or non-existent, rumours and conspiracies tend to spread like wildfire. But by conducting regular briefings or releasing statements where appropriate, the NTSB is helping keep that speculation to a minimum, in contrast with other recent tragedies that we've seen where official briefings were kept to a minimum. Finally, I think it's worth highlighting here that the accident happened during the US government shutdown, which meant that for the first few weeks of its investigation, the NTSB's people were doing all of this vital work without regular pay, which makes their work all the more admirable, but frankly is the last thing any of us want to see when the events of this magnitude hit our industry. Now, I hope you found this update informative. Please let us know if you've got any questions about the investigation. Are there any points that we've missed that weren't too speculative? Let us know in the comments below. My name's Ben Watts. You're watching Mentor now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.